I'm speaking to you from about 6,000 kilometers away in England. Central Siberia and England are rather a long way apart. It's unfortunate that I cannot be with you in person today, but I'm going to do my best to be with you in spirit. Here's the title of my presentation: Taking a Long View, 2 Centuries of Urban Morphology. However, most of my concern will be with the last 100 years, and especially the last 50 years. And at the end, I shall briefly extend my view forward into the immediate future. In a recently written paper, I was astonished to read the assertion that the modern discipline of urban morphology was founded in the 1960s. Now, I began my urban morphology PhD thesis in 1960. So you may not be surprised that that assertion caught my attention. However, the momentary thought that I might have been one of the founding fathers of urban morphology instantly vanished as I started to recall the very long list of urban morphological research that preceded my existence, a list that started back in the 19th century. Thinking about this long list of past research brought to mind something I've been made aware of as editor of ISUF's journal, Urban Morphology. And this is the tendency for earlier work in our field to be forgotten unduly quickly. This was reinforced when I read another recently written paper on a subject central to urban morphology, in which none of the very relevant work by urban morphologists in the 1970s and 80s was mentioned. Such ignoring of the past is not acceptable, and this is part of the reason for the phrase "taking a long view" in my title. It's not that I'm going to dwell to excess on the very early days of urban morphology, but I am going to suggest that we can benefit from taking a longer view than some of us are accustomed to doing. By that I mean that we should be aware of where the research and practice we're concerned with at the moment has come from, and give more thought to where it is going to, or indeed might be going to in the future. This brings to mind an English saying, and I quote, "If you want to know where you are going, you need to know where you have come from." Let's begin to explore that theme of taking a long view by going back very briefly to the middle of the 19th century. This is a notable contribution to that, at that time to urban morphology as the study of urban form, or the study of urban landscapes, as some would say now. Eckhard Ehlers reminded us of this morphological model of the pre-industrial city when he reproduced this drawing of it in our journal. The original was published by J.W.R. in 1841. The concentric growth rings that he identified in the urban landscapes of Moscow may remind you of concentric zones that were being identified 100 years later in America. And as you can see lower down, Cole also produced a 3-dimensional model of the heights of buildings. Nearly 30 years older than Cole, but still active in the mid-19th century, was Carl Ritter. He was drawing our attention to landscapes more generally at this time. And this concern with all sorts of landscapes led to the distinction being recognized between the cultural landscape, of which cities are of course striking examples, and the natural landscape. I draw attention to this duality of cultural landscape and natural landscape because it's a theme that arguably has a present-day place in urban morphology, albeit at the moment a small one, that I want to consider towards the end of my presentation. And here, at the end of the 19th century, are two of the key researchers on landscape, von Richthofen, more on the natural side, and Otto Schluter, more on the cultural side. Like Ritter, both were from the German-speaking world. A notable feature of urban morphological research in the early years of the 20th century was its multidisciplinary character. Architecture, history, and geography were the most strongly represented disciplines. All of the key contributors were from the German-speaking world, which may surprise some of you, given how few contributors there are from the German-speaking world at this conference. And this man, the German geographer Otto Schluter, continued to be influential right through to the middle years of the 20th century. He and a number of other distinguished geographers were based in the University of Berlin in the interwar years, particularly in the second half of the 1920s and the early 1930s. And it was to some extent Schluter's morphological approach that led to this man, M.R.G. Conzen, having an especial interest in urban morphological processes and the forces underlying them. But that interest of Conzen's within a few years ceased to be based in Central Europe. The widespread upheaval in the years before and during the Second World War changed the intellectual world and, of course, many other things. Conzen was one of the many who left Germany and did not go back, at least not to live. Many who had been key figures in Central European research in a variety of fields at this time dispersed elsewhere, and Conzen was part of that dispersal. In Conzen's case, it was migration to the UK, and this photograph was taken about 20 years later in his new homeland in England. In urban morphology, as in many fields of knowledge, one of the changes that became apparent after the Second World War was the tendency for research interests to be more concentrated within individual disciplines than they had been before the war. Researchers in the first half of the 20th century tended to have considerable cross-disciplinary awareness, but this was less evident in the second half of the 20th century. In the case of urban morphology, the weak connections between geographers, architects, and historians was evident over several decades in the limited amount of cross-disciplinary referencing. Conzen was acutely aware of this defect. One of the manifestations of this problem was the almost entirely separate development of what were later to become known as the Konzenian school within geography and the Muratorian school within architecture. Concern about this minimal interdisciplinary contact eventually began to take tangible form, notably in the 1980s and 1990s. It became evident in the organization of conferences that began to bring closer some of the different schools of thought, 4 of which are shown here. In fact, the foundation of ISUF itself was part of that process of developing links between different schools. However, even in the case of the Konzenian and Muratorian schools, this was collaboration rather than a unifying movement. Distinct schools of thought have remained. In terms of disciplines, ISUF has brought together topics of urban morphological interest that are common to different disciplines. Just to take one example, street patterns are an interest of researchers in all these disciplines, but for several decades after the Second World War, they had practically no common meeting places or means of communication where their shared interests were brought together. Of course, to think of urban morphology in terms of disciplines and schools of thought is by no means the only way of recognizing some kind of order in what was and is going on in research and practice in urban morphology. Another somewhat different way of viewing urban morphology has been recognized by Karl Kropf. He recognized 4 distinct approaches to urban morphology: spatial analytical, configurational, process typological, and historico-geographical. The last 2, process typological and historico-geographical, are essentially synonymous with the Muratorian and Konzinian approaches, respectively. The first 2 are distinct from these 2 schools and have different origins. They were largely unrepresented in the foundation of ISUF, but papers adopting their approaches have subsequently appeared in ISUF's journal and have been presented at ISUF conferences. Clearly, a lot has recently been happening and is currently happening in urban morphology. And these last few slides depicted just a few ways of trying to obtain, in broad terms, a sense of what these developments are, particularly in relation to ISUF. If we just focus on the period during which ISUF has existed, which is a little under a quarter of a century, at least 2 major changes are evident. One is growth, and the other is increasing diversity. Growth can be measured in various ways. One of the cruder but most readily accomplished in this case is changes over time in the number of papers indexed in the Web of Science that use the term urban morphology. Of course, changes over time in the number and size of the journals and other types of publication indexed need to be borne in mind. There's been a huge increase in the coverage by the Web of Science over the past quarter of a century. Nevertheless, the number of papers containing the term urban morphology increased nearly 20-fold over this recent time span of about 20 years. This is almost certainly indicative of a significant increase in the actual amount of urban morphological work undertaken. However, do bear in mind that publications indexed in the Web of Science particularly cover those in the English language. Increasing diversity is suggested by the increase in the number of journals and other publications indexed in the Web of Science that carry papers containing the term urban morphology. There were only 14 such journals in the last 5 years of the 20th century, compared with about 100 in the most recent 5-year span, a roughly 7-fold increase. So the nearly 20-fold increase in the number of urban morphology papers must be taken in the context of much greater journal coverage by the Web of Science, and also a major increase in the coverage of other types of publication. If journals are listed in rank order according to the number of papers they carry that contain the term urban morphology, these are just the top 10 of the nearly 100. The journal now having the most papers containing the term urban morphology is perhaps unsurprisingly urban morphology. Geography journals collectively still contain more urban morphology papers than journals in any other discipline, although only 1 geography journal gets into the top 10. Actually, the number of urban morphology papers in planning journals is now close to the number in geography journals. Architectural journals contain relatively few urban morphology papers, but this reflects the fact that with the exception of papers in ISUF's own journal, most journal articles on this subject by architects are in journals published in languages other than English and not indexed in the Web of Science. Here's just a sample of the more readily recognizable fields of knowledge covered by journal titles that contain papers using the term urban morphology. The reason I've included fields such as acoustics and waste management is just to make the point that the term urban morphology has penetrated some fields that you may find surprising. Of course, some of these fields have very few journals that carry urban morphology papers. In looking at this slide and the previous 2, it's important to remind ourselves that the terms applied to fields of knowledge vary. They vary in their usage, they vary in their connotations. there is also misusage. Even where the definition of urban morphology as the study of urban form appears to be similarly understood across a number of journals, both the approaches adopted by authors and the subject matter may vary considerably. In terms of the size of the field of urban morphology, a lot has happened since J.G. Cole produced this model 175 years ago. And we need to understand this history of growth and increasing diversity. And we need to ask questions about the value and impact of the research of which it's made up. And, to go further, how can we enhance the adoption and further development of those concepts and findings that we believe are of especial value? Increasing usage of the term urban morphology across an increasing spectrum of fields of knowledge is one thing. Increasing the contribution that urban morphology is making is another. It would be a mistake to equate the amount of usage of the term urban morphology with the significance of the contributions to knowledge and practice that urban morphologists are making. To explore this distinction across the entire field of urban morphology is clearly not practicable without a major investigation. But in my remaining time in this presentation, I should like to look quickly at just one urban morphological concept and comment very briefly on how it has been developing, its impact, and how research relating to it might progress. And I'm thinking here of progress not just within urban morphology. I'm also thinking of what research and practice relating to this concept might offer more widely, including in fields of knowledge shown on the previous slide. The concept I've chosen is one that has become increasingly popular in recent years, the fringe belt concept. It also has the merit of being an example of the relevance of taking a long view. In fact, the fringe belt concept first appeared in a publication over 80 years ago in this paper by Herbert Louis on the geographical structure of Greater Berlin. Its origin does in a sense take us back to that slide I showed you earlier, in which the natural landscape and the cultural landscape were depicted as parallel to one another. You may prefer to think in terms of the broad duality of the natural environment and the cultural environment. Interestingly, the research of the originator of the fringe belt concept spanned all the way from the cultural side to the very natural side, from urban morphology to geomorphology. Herbert Louis, who was working in the University of Berlin in the 1930s, was actually later to become best known for his work in geomorphology. Here is the first representation of the fringe belt concept in Berlin in 1936. In fact, to be more accurate, it's a redrawing of the original very much later in 2009 by Michael P. Konzen, whose father, M.R.G. Konzen, in the early post-war years further developed the concept in a very major way. You may, I suppose, even be reminded of J.G. Cole's diagram of 1841. What Herbert Louis recognized was that towns and cities don't grow evenly outward. Their development is made up of phases of growth, sometimes rapid growth, and periods of slow growth or practically no growth at all. The most notable thing that happens during rapid growth is that a zone of new housing is created at the edge of the city. During periods of practically no growth or very slow growth, a variety of other land uses acquire sites at the edge of the city. They form a belt, a fringe belt of generally low intensity land uses that are able to acquire sites during a time when there is little land being acquired for building houses and other forms of residential land use. When the residential area eventually starts growing again, the fringe belt becomes embedded in the urban area. In Berlin, the two innermost fringe belts were associated with walls around the edge of the city. Here's one of them. as it existed more than 200 years ago. However, the fringe belt farthest out, when Louis was working in Berlin in the 1930s, was more typical of the late 19th century and 20th century fringe belts in the Western world. Here, for example, in Birmingham, UK, there's a fringe belt that came into existence in the early 20th century when there was a long, very major slowdown in residential growth, a house building slump. A fringe belt of very low density land use came into existence. An Edwardian fringe belt, we call it. It had land uses characteristic of fringe belts. Major land uses were parks, institutions such as colleges and schools, recreational areas, sports grounds and public utilities. This belt is now deeply embedded within the city, as you can see. The present edge of the city is much farther out. Here's a recent photograph of part of the Edwardian fringe belt, including part of the campus of a university, some woodland, a golf course, a lake and a school. The city centre is in the background. The present urban fringe is about 11 kilometres, about 7 miles, behind the camera. So this fringe belt is deeply embedded within the urban area. Michael Conzen's re-representation in 2009 of the fringe belts of Berlin was reminding some of us of the very different intellectual and organizational environment of the 1930s. However, by the time he was writing his paper in 2009, the number of fringe belt studies was multiplying rapidly, and these had spread far beyond Berlin and far beyond the English market town of Alnwick, where M.R.G. Conzen undertook his classic development of the fringe belt concept. And it is to M.R.G. Conzen that we owe much of the groundwork on which later fringe belt research was to build. What Michael Conzen was doing in 2009 was providing us with a broad perspective on the large majority of work on fringe belts that had by then been done. He listed over 50 publications in which fringe belts had been discussed by that time, and many more publications dealing with fringe belts have been produced since then. Michael Conzen's paper was one of the key ones in our journal Urban Morphology, and I should like to take it as a starting point for the last part of what I have to say, because I do think we need to be more conscious than we have been about where our research in urban morphology is taking us. My message here is not just about the value of the fringe belt concept, significant though I believe that is. It's also about where and to what extent that value is being recognized and built on. A key question, I believe, concerns the potential for further development of this work, as indeed of other urban morphological research. As with other advances in research, we need to be thinking about the wider implications for the future within both research and practice. So for a few minutes, let's just consider the example of fringe belt research. I leave you to think about other examples of significant urban morphological ideas and findings and where they are taking us or where they could be taking us. Something that has been largely undocumented hitherto is the extent to which reference is being made to fringe belt research more widely. For example, is usage extending beyond a fairly limited group of interacting researchers? Something that has concerned a number of ISUF members is that the link between urban morphology as a field of research and other fields may not be as healthy as we would wish. It's one thing to trace usage of the term urban morphology in journals in other fields, as I did very briefly earlier. It's another thing to establish that findings in urban morphology, as we understand this field of knowledge, are actually being used in other fields and in practice. However, let's at least make a start at trying to do this. In the case of the fringe belt concept, I offer a few thoughts based largely on a single paper that's arguably as well known as any published on fringe belts in recent years. It's a paper I've already referred to, in fact. It's Michael Conson's paper of 2009, published in our journal, Urban Morphology. Here, as you see, is part of the first page, containing no more than part of the abstract. Here we have the citations in Google Scholar of this paper on fringe belts. I've chosen Google Scholar for this purpose because, unlike the Web of Science and Scopus, it includes citations from beyond the main range of international research publications, sometimes from well beyond. Google Scholar also has the merit of better coverage of publications in languages other than English. This last characteristic is useful for us within ISUF because we are a very multilingual body. Members of ISUF have a very wide range of first languages, albeit that publications and conference presentations aimed at an international readership are frequently in English. This diagram is interesting if we want to have an inkling of the other languages in which our journal papers and conference papers are cited. It shows the number of publications in different languages that had cited Conson's paper up until 2015. His paper was published in English. However, the predominance of English in the citing publications is perhaps not as great as you might have guessed. One of the things that is evidently happening is that some readers of this paper are citing it in publications in their own languages. As you see here, these languages included Chinese, Portuguese, Italian, and Russian. Also of interest are the disciplines of the publications in which citations are occurring. There was a strong concentration in three disciplines or fields of knowledge: planning, urban morphology, and geography together accounted for nearly 2/3 of the citing disciplines or fields of knowledge. But there was a long tail of those that had a single citation, several of them difficult to attach a disciplinary label to. This is a much more compact distribution. It shows where the citations came from that cite the publications that cited Conson's paper. The very large majority of these citations are from planning and geography publications. So what are we to conclude from this slide and the previous two? Clearly, much more bibliographic analysis is needed. I presented this bibliographic analysis of this one paper on the fringe belt concept in the hope that it might prompt your further thought about what happens to our research beyond our own immediate field of interest. You may be wondering, however, what has happened to the fringe belt concept, or indeed to other urban morphological concepts, when it comes to practical applications, for example, in planning. The sort of data we are dealing with here tells us little about this. One of the problems is that technical terms such as fringe belt tend to be avoided in fields of practical application. For example, in planning documents such as this one that are intended for reading by non-specialists. There are planning documents in which the fringe belt concept has been used in preparing local plans, but use of the actual term fringe belt has been avoided. In this example of a British local plan, a term was used that was thought to be better understood by the general public. The symbols representing the fringe belts are shown in the bottom right corner, but the term used to describe them is community spaces and utilities, which were the predominant land uses in these particular fringe belts. In such circumstances, ascertaining the extent to which an idea originating in academic research has influenced practice is not straightforward. In discussing the influence of Michael Conson's paper, I've brought practically up to the present my very rapid, long view. However, taking a long view in urban morphology entails not only looking at the road we have followed to get where we are now, but also thinking about how that road can and should be extended. So now we come to the forward-looking part of the long view. And perhaps we could benefit from the help of Dr. Faust, whom you see here. I'm thinking of the vision of inspiration that came in a flash of light through his study window in 1652. as he contemplated what to do next. In the case of the fringe belt concept, the scope for future work would seem to be considerable. Perhaps most important is the development of links to types of research and practice that have hitherto followed separate lines of inquiry that can benefit from the contribution of fringe belt studies and from which in turn urban morphology more generally can itself benefit. An obvious link, at least in the case of fringe belts associated with city walls, is to research and practice in the field commonly referred to in recent years as heritage. Another link with potential is to ecology, and more particularly the study of urban green spaces. This is a link that might well have been congenial to some of the researchers working long ago who were recognizing the link between, on the one hand, built environments and on the other, natural environments. Fringe belts account for a large proportion of urban green space and in some cases areas of water within the urban area. In recent years, some ecologists have become accustomed to refer to ecosystem services and have demonstrated the benefits of green space to urban populations. We're accustomed as urban morphologists to terms such as community services and commercial services, but we less often think of the much more extensive vegetated areas of cities, notably within fringe belts, as services. The Urban Morphology Research Group in Birmingham, UK is now collaborating with ecologists to study the relationship between fringe belts and ecosystem services, specifically the services provided by green spaces. This type of work is on cities' fringe belt structures as services. For example, the role that fringe belt green spaces perform in relation to health, recreation, aesthetics, air pollution mitigation, flood regulation. In the major Chinese city of Nanjing, there are 3 fringe belts. I cannot resist the temptation, as I near the end of my presentation, to refer to the scope in one of the fringe belts in particular for exploring the interrelationship between urban morphological aspects of fringe belts and ecosystem services. Of especial interest ecologically and from the standpoint of heritage is the very long Ming fringe belt. It's the farthest out of the 3 fringe belts shown on this map. It follows closely the massive 33 kilometers long city wall that was largely erected in the latter part of the 14th century. In appreciating the spatial structure of the city, this fringe belt is of major importance. Here's a very small section of it and of the wall viewed from the green spaces outside the wall, although you can also just glimpse the tree-covered area inside this part of the wall. Most of this Ming wall still exists today. This is a small part of the western section of the Ming wall from outside. The wall is on the left. There's green space both inside and outside the wall. You can also see to the right part of this substantial waterway that stretches around the wall in a kind of massive ditch. Here's another small part of the western stretch of this fringe belt. The wall is just off the photograph to the left. So what you're looking at here is a stretch of extramural fringe belt immediately outside the wall, and like the stretch on the previous slide, containing this waterway on the right. In the last 40 or so years, Nanjing has grown massively and very rapidly beyond this fringe belt, and you can see a small part of that massive growth in the blocks of flats on the right. The older, more central part of the city is off the picture to the left. This Ming fringe belt in Nanjing has continued to be a major feature in the morphological structure of the city as the built-up area of the city has moved increasingly farther out, leaving what was for so long the edge of the city as a zone deeply embedded within the city. The deeper the Ming fringe belt becomes embedded within the city, the more important in some respects it becomes. for example, aesthetically, in mitigating air pollution, providing recreational spaces, and more controversially, even in places being cultivated in small plots by informal occupiers. It is starting to become recognized as a meeting ground of perspectives on environmental health and cultural heritage. So, are we thinking more again about the duality of natural and cultural environments that was recognized long ago and which I referred to at the beginning of my presentation? Well, that's perhaps something to think about if you're convinced by my recommendation that there's considerable merit in taking a long view. In this presentation, we've come quite a long way since the urban morphology of J.G. Cole, depicted here again. And in relation to the fringe belt concept at least, we've come a fair way conceptually since Herbert Lewis' paper of over 80 years ago. But not so far since M.R.G. Conzen's work over half a century ago, and he was already looking into the future. If he were here now, he would, I'm sure, urge us to view the future in context. I say that not only to please the followers among you of Konzen and Muratori, but because we do need to maintain a broad, integrated perspective, and certainly not to lose sight of where urban morphology has come from as a field of knowledge and its various achievements, some of which provide foundations to build on. One of the mistakes that has been made over a number of recent decades has been failure to benefit as much as we could from the experience to be gained from previous studies, and that includes sometimes studies outside our particular disciplinary specialism. It also includes work that may have been done well before research topics that are currently fashionable were even thought about. Hence, I end with this image of Dr. Faust, and I return to the title of my presentation, and I suggest to you the merits of sometimes taking a long view. Thank you for listening. I'm sorry I've not been able to be with you personally in Krasnoyarsk.